specifically, I want to dig into MERS. Because that is so shady and so crazy. And oddly enough, when I realized reading your book is MERS actually has some surprise direct ties to Covington Burling, which is where Attorney General Eric Holder worked before and after being Attorney General. So talk a little bit about how MERS just really kind of shook everything we had to its core here.
So MERS plays into this picture in a couple ways. So when banks realized that the way for them to make money was to securitize these loans, to transfer them several times and then send them out to investors, they realized that the way property law works in this country is every time you transfer a mortgage, you're supposed to send that documentation over to a county office where the property is located and pay a nominal fee, $35, $50, something like that. Banks didn't want to do that. You're talking about millions of loans. You're talking about multiple transfers on each mortgage. They didn't want the time of creating the documentation, and they didn't want the cost of paying $35, $50 on every one of the transfers. So they created this private registry, this private system called MERS, the Mortgage Electronic Registration System. And MERS enabled them, so when they originated the mortgage, they said that they initiated the transfer of the mortgage to MERS. And then they could do all their other transfers inside MERS, which is basically a spreadsheet where they say, this guy sold it to this guy, he sold it to this guy, he sold it to this guy. And then at the end of that process, if they needed to foreclose or something, they would quickly do a transfer from MERS back out to whoever wanted to do the foreclosure. The problem
multiple foreclosures oftentimes, right? Like multiple banks are trying to foreclose at the same time.
Yeah, that did happen on several occasions.
Yeah.
So it was a big tax evasion scheme. It saved them millions, maybe billions of dollars. And MERS was owned by the big banks along with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was a very, very explicit system to lower costs by using this private database and effectively privatize the system of property ownership in this country. And the problem was manifold. First of all, anybody could use the MERS database. They would sell their corporate seal on their website for $25. Anybody could become a corporate officer for a very nominal fee and then have access to the database. And the database was just often wrong. People did studies looking at the database and seeing, error rates of 30, 40, 50%. So that was number one. Number two, it existed in this sort of legal netherworld where the idea that MERS, which had no interest in the loan, could then foreclose on somebody was legally suspect, and then there were challenges to this in virtually every state. And our foreclosure law really goes from state to state and sometimes district to district. And so you had these overlapping legalities with respect to MERS, who was very shady. It's a shell corporation. There are 25 people that work there, and yet the MERS database held 60 million loans at its height. And they would say, oh, we're just a nominee, we don't have any interest in the loan. And in the same brief, they would say, but MERS has the legal right to foreclose on somebody. So it was a very strange system, and it was and it was also necessary. Like, we would not have had this massive securitization, this massive housing bubble, and this massive collapse if it wasn't for structures like MERS, because it wouldn't have been cost effective for the banks to actually engage in the mass securitization they did during the housing bubble without some cost-cutting measures. Things like MERS, things like not actually funding the trusts or not creating the documents on each reported transfer. So MERS was kind of the hamburger helper of the financial crisis in some ways. It enabled a lot of this stuff to go on, and it operated so suspect from a legal perspective that when the foreclosure wave happened, it became very difficult for the banks to justify their conduct and to actually get proof of standing to foreclose.